Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. The floods of life. Quite a powerful image, I find. I expect that all of us can relate to an image like that. Even if we've been fortunate not to experience a full-fledged flood, like some of the people in the South or in parts of Wisconsin, maybe we've driven through mildly flooding roads during a very heavy rainstorm. Or maybe we've had a basement flood from water backing up through a storm drain. Those in themselves are challenging enough. They're dangerous, they're messy, they're smelly, and overpowering in their speed and ability to disrupt and frighten us. The Buddha used the image of floods often in his teachings because it is such a powerful and accurate parallel for how we experience difficult circumstances in our lives. And it's the image that's frequently chosen to explain the most essential and fundamental teaching of all. Crossing over a flood, getting through a flood, is often the image chosen to explain nibbana, enlightenment, the ending of greed, hatred, and delusion, the cessation of craving, and the release of identification and self-view, just as David was saying. It's an image that really encapsulates the whole purpose of the Buddha's teachings. And it's notable that even in the Old Testament, crossing the flooded Red Sea was the means to obtaining freedom from oppression of slavery. Fortunately for us, we don't need to rely on Moses to part the waters. The Buddha offers a more practical and internal way for us ourselves to cross the floods to freedom. Here's how another monk, Thanissaro Bhikkhu, describes the image of the flood in the Buddha's teachings. He says, a recurrent image in these dialogues is of life as a flood of birth, aging, and death, sorrow and lamentation, stress and suffering. The purpose of spiritual practice is to find a way across the flood to the safety of the far shore. The far shore being the other image often used for Nibbana. So reflect for a moment, if you would, on what you experience as a flood to the heart or the mind. Poor Maureen has some breakout room floods, I think, tonight. But what are the floods that you have? Maybe it's strong desires or habits that swamp your ability to resist them. Strong urges for recognition or achievement or accomplishment. Maybe these urges drive you so intensely that at times you make poor decisions that result in harm for yourself or others. Or maybe you're familiar with depressive or discouraged floods that cause you to withdraw from others or even from yourself, curling up in avoidance and fear. Or perhaps you've noticed a flood of ideas that you hold so dearly, so tightly, that you are blinded and unable to recognize any other way to think about a situation. Or maybe there's some other way that this image of a flood you recognize as being swamped and flooded, and how that rings true for your life. The Buddha was speaking of four floods that he identified that cause us to lose our bearings and lead to suffering. He talked about the flood of sense desires, the flood of becoming, the flood of views, and the flood of ignorance. You maybe come up with your own list of the sort of floods that swamp your heart and mind. But whether you use the Buddha's list or your own, what matters is that floods can be crossed over by training the mind and heart. And equally, we need to wake up to the real dangers that these floods present, because an untrained heart will be swept away by these floods, the floods of suffering that we will all experience as human beings. So what does the Buddha actually say about crossing these floods either in terms of our meditation practice or in life? This image of a flood is in many teachings that he offered, but I want to focus on one specifically tonight. And it is the first sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya, which is the collected discourses of the Buddha in the Pali Canon. It's a huge volume of, I don't know, at least 2,000 pages. And this is the very first teaching. It's a very brief one, and its title is Crossing the Flood. It's one of my very favorite suttas because it is so concise, so clear. In this teaching, what happens, it's a story, as these suttas often are. So in this teaching, a deva, a heavenly being, comes to the Buddha and asks him, she or he says, "Good sir, how did you cross the flood?" In other words, what she's asking is, how was it that you, the Buddha, became enlightened? How was it that you put an end to suffering? So that's the beginning, that question. But it's also helpful, I think, to notice what the deva is asking and what is not being asked. For example, what the deva did not ask is, how did you stop the flood? Or how did you avoid the flood? Or how did you keep the flood from occurring? Or who or what protected you from the flood? Or who helped you cross the flood? Because the deva asked the question in this way, "Good sir, how did you cross the flood?" it demonstrates a shared understanding about the nature of suffering in a sentient body, in a human body. This question, as asked, recognizes that there is a flood in the first place. It's there. It can't be avoided or stopped. It's there. There is no avoiding or sidestepping it. There's no stopping it. It can only be crossed over. There's nobody else that can protect us from it. We each have to cross it for ourselves. The Buddha crossed the flood. The Buddha was a human being, and what the Buddha can do, anyone can do. The flood can be crossed. So it was a logical and reasonable question that the deva asked. How did you cross the flood? How did you do that? How did you awaken? And the Buddha's reply is as follows. By not halting and by not straining, I crossed the flood. But that answer is still a little vague to the questioner. So they ask again. They say, "But how is it, dear sir, that by not halting and by not straining, you crossed the flood?" And the Buddha replies, "When I came to a standstill, friend, I sank. But when I struggled, then I was swept away. It is in this way that by not halting and by not straining, I crossed the flood." And the deva responds with a little verse. "After a long time, at last I see a Brahmin who is fully unbound, who by not halting, not straining, has crossed over attachment to the world." So Zen Buddhism is known for koans. Theravada doesn't really have koans per se, but to me, the sutta from the Pali Canon, while not a part of the Zen canon, is a koan. It makes thinking stop for a moment. How can we not halt, but also not move? What else is there? So a teaching like this is an invitation to investigate for ourselves. What is it to halt or stop? What is it to struggle or strain forward? What isn't either of those? What would it feel like not to do either of those? And as with a koan, the answer isn't based on analytic thought. We don't figure out the answer to a koan or to this sutta. Instead, the response, the knowing, is an intuitive knowing. It's a sense of understanding that through our heart and our experience, not through thinking it out. We can only learn what this might mean, what the Buddha was trying to point us to, by trying it out ourselves, by reflecting. How does any moment feel like a halting, a holding back, a stopping? Or how does any moment feel like a straining, a surging forward? And then considering what needs to be released to find something that is not either of those. What needs to be released to understand what it might be to not be halting or not be straining? This instruction on crossing the flood can be a useful investigation during our meditation. I find that when I investigate it, I recognize that at times I do stop or halt during meditation. Halting in the sense that I've given up on staying mindful of my meditation object. I've just allowed the mind to wander on its own, daydreaming. That's a kind of halting, right? It's a kind of stopping. And when I can remember to notice, I certainly also recognize the frequent experience of struggle or straining in meditation. Squeezing the breath or leaning forward, impatiently wanting the time to pass, or trying so hard to pay attention in a tight, constricted, unhelpful way that increases suffering. Both of these, the halting, the straining, are strategies about resisting something, resisting some feeling or experience to get rid of it, either by withdrawing, halting, stopping, or by rushing ahead, struggling, straining. Finding that middle way in life and in meditation is the heart of the Buddha's teachings. It requires that we stay open and present, aware, awake, with calm, ease, and gentleness. It's an awareness that is curious without being demanding, interested without being directive. The word that most captures the experience for me is an open-hearted willingness. Being willing to be with things as they are, with kindness and patience. Being willing to experience whatever is present without turning away, stopping, halting, and without rushing past. Not struggling to control anything. Simply knowing, as Ajahn Sumedho frequently says, it's like this. And often, exactly as David said, what urges us to stop or to struggle is self-view. The powerful feeling of I, me, mine convinces us to halt, tells us we are useless, incapable, or not up to the task. That same demanding self-view is also what pushes us to struggle or fight against the reality of what is out of our control. Letting go only happens when we can get out of our small sense of self and release into a heart that is open to all things and not limited by a narrow, inaccurate, idea of a me. Whatever is causing this reaction of halting or struggling may still be present, right? The flood is still happening. There is a flood. Letting go of our reactivity to it may not end the cause, especially not right away. What changes is our relationship to the experience, our relationship to the flood. We can attune to know the truth of what is happening and remain mindful and present with it, regardless of whether it is pleasant or unpleasant. We no longer require the experience to be anything other than it is. And that is peace. The peace of the Buddha is our relationship to experience. It isn't the experience itself. We are learning to relate peacefully to the conditions of our life, even if those conditions themselves are not peaceful, like a flood. But it's no surprise that this is not easy. The image of the flood is appropriate because floods overwhelm and sweep things away. And as we see on the news reports of floods worldwide, moving water is enormously powerful. And so too are the floods of the heart. So it shouldn't surprise us that sometimes we cannot find the middle way of stepping back and dropping our identification with self. That's why it requires practice, and why we call what we do a practice. Sitting or walking in formal meditation gives us practice, working with floods that may be smaller than those that overwhelm us unexpectedly in our daily life. Part of what we learn is knowing our capacity. How much flooding can I manage and still stay present? As we continue to practice, we can notice how, with time, with continued practice and patience, mindfulness does get stronger, and our capacity to stay present also increases. So too does our capacity to recognize when mindfulness has lapsed, and the flood has swept us away, so that we are caught in self-view, in fear, in discouragement, in greed, in anxiety, or some other sort of flood of feeling. Realizing how to cross these floods of life takes patience, kindness, and clarity. So in your meditation, I'm suggesting you might give this exploration a try. Ask yourself at this moment, right now, is there a halting, a holding back, a stopping? At this moment, is there a struggle or a straining forward? Can I recognize either and let go into a willingness, a curiosity to learn from whatever is present right now? What has arisen may be very difficult, even painful. It might not be at all easeful, but our relationship to it can be easeful, can have ease, can be neither pushing away or clinging. Just as David said, a heart not consumed with self-view can relate to circumstances with an openness to bear it all. It can see the truth of what is present with clarity, with compassion, and a steadiness that carries us over. And this is what allows us to learn and grow, persisting, staying steady, staying present through these floods of life. I needed to do this just last weekend. I was listening to an inspiring Dhamma talk by a teacher named Ajahn Chandasiri. She's a longtime nun with Ajahn Sumedho. And she spoke about releasing judgments and instead focusing on the strengths that people have. Very reasonable suggestion, not an unfamiliar one, probably. But once she said that, immediately I recalled how earlier in the week I'd become frustrated with a relative who had been saying the same thing about the same situation for years, and yet never seemed to learn from it, to do anything different. Fortunately, I didn't say anything to the person, but I did say something to my husband about my frustration, and that I just kept hearing the same insight over and over, and yet it had never caused them to do anything differently. And it was I was pretty irritable about it. But hearing that reminder in the Dhamma talk from Ajahn Chandasiri, I immediately knew that of course there was a kinder and equally accurate way to look at that situation. This person has many other positive qualities, but I had overlooked them because of my frustration with wanting things to be better for her. This harsh response was not a pleasant recollection. It did not feel good to remember how I had sort of immediately gone to this harsh judgment. It was a flood experience. It was the sort of memory that easily might have generated a halt, not wanting to be with that regret, and the self-blame that could arise, or that could have generated a struggle and strengthened my judgments about how I was right and that person was wrong. Fortunately, because I'd been reflecting on this sutta, I could wake up. I could know I was in the midst of a flood and know that the way to cross it was not by halting or by struggling. I could let go and allow myself to feel the regret, the hurt, and simply know that's what was present in that moment. And in that way, I could learn from it. I could feel directly my heart tighten from the harshness of the judgment. And I could avoid adding more pain by judging myself too. I could see it as it was, know how to do better next time, and let it go. Ajahn Amaro sometimes talks about this as a listening relationship with our heart-mind. He said it like this: listening is much more effective than stopping thought or cutting it off. When we listen, there is a different mode employed by the heart. Instead of trying to cut it off, we receive thought without making anything out of it. Let me read that one more time. Listening is a much more effective way than stopping thought or cutting it off. When we listen, there's a different mode employed by the heart. Instead of trying to cut it off, we receive thought without making anything out of it. This brings me back to weather analogies. I love weather analogies because I know I can relate to the weather with non-clinging, without making anything out of it, to use Ajahn Amaro's phrase. I am convinced that an open, courageous, steady heart is possible because I've experienced it on days when it rains, even though I want to work in the garden. I can see that it's raining and not end up railing against the gods or the weatherman or myself for putting it off and leaving it to today. All those different reasons. I don't do that. I know it's just rain. I can know that rain happens, that rain and sun are uncertain and changeable, and I can let go of my desire for what I want. And it isn't even too hard to do. I can, without too much struggle, release self-view and simply know it's like this. It's raining. And that is a peaceful, happier way to relate to life in the world. And it is much different from how I used to be before I encountered these teachings. Back then, something like unwanted rain could make me frustrated and unhappy all day, or maybe even longer. The swings of the heart are like the weather. The heart can overwhelm us with tsunami-like strength, tsunami-like storms, or it can overwhelm us and awe us with brilliant blue skies of delight. But all of these are uncertain and changeable. They are not who we are, and they will all result in suffering if we cling to them. Now, I'm not claiming that non-clinging is easy, or that I remember or am always able to let go. But I feel it is essential for all of us to remember to share this possibility, that it is possible to do that, to relate to the floods of life with peace, to not halt and not struggle, to find a wise, compassionate way to relate. Here's one story Jack Kornfield said when he was reflecting about Ajahn Chah. So this is Jack Kornfield, but he also talks about Ram Dass in the middle, as well as Ajahn Chah. So he says, the Buddha taught us to look at the Dhamma, the truth, not to look at other people, but to see clearly and to see into ourselves, to know our limits. Ram Dass asked Ajahn Chah about limits. He asked, can you teach if your own work isn't completed, if you're not fully enlightened? A really good question. And Ajahn Chah replied, he said, be honest with them. Tell them what you know from your heart and tell people what's possible. Don't pretend to be able to lift big rocks when you can only lift small ones. Yet it doesn't hurt to tell people that if you exercise and if you work at it, it is possible to lift this. This sutta tells us that crossing our floods, the floods of our heart, is possible. And this sutta on crossing the floods is not simply an analogy or some poetic image. It's real. It's true. It's really how it works. One of the most frequent laments I hear during my weekly meditation group is people saying, what do we do about the bigger issues in the world? How does this practice address them? Neither stopping nor struggling is the way we can face the terrible issues and dangers that are so evident in the world today. When we are distraught about the risks to democracy, or the melting of the Arctic ice cap, or the ongoing presence of a racial caste system, or COVID, or any of the other serious, real issues we face, this teaching addresses those floods as well. Being distraught is drowning in suffering, and it is not of help to us or the issues we care deeply about. The Buddha teaches us not to drown in suffering, but to respond to the suffering we see with compassionate equanimity. Compassionate equanimity is having concern and understanding about a situation without being overwhelmed or flooded by it, without halting or straining. With clarity of heart, we can know what, if anything, we might do to alleviate the suffering we see. This teaching can't and won't give us a universal solution to the problem itself. What it gives us is how to settle the heart so that we can know for ourselves a wise, kind, and compassionate response. The Crossing the Flood Sutta is a how, not a specific what to do. It gives us a how to do it. It doesn't tell us what, because of course the situations in life are, so many, millions and millions and millions. But the how can apply to them all. So here's another example of this fundamentally same teaching. Ajahn Chah, as I mentioned, was this great meditation master in Thailand. Ajahn Sumedho was his first Western disciple who went to study with him in Thailand. After many years, Ajahn Chah saw the need in the West. There was a request from the West. And so Ajahn Chah sent his disciple, Ajahn Sumedho, back to England to open a monastery in the response of requests from lay people. In the final years of his life, Ajahn Chah had a stroke, and he lost his ability to move, to speak, and to teach. For 10 years, he was paralyzed and cared for by sort of groups, sort of little bunches of monks that would be with him for several days and exercise him and clean him and feed him. And then a new bunch of monks would come in and take care of him. But before he lost his ability to speak, as he was failing, he sent a message to Ajahn Sumedho, the last communication Ajahn Sumedho ever had with Ajahn Chah. And this is what Ajahn Chah said. He said, Sumedho, whenever you have feelings of love and hate for anything whatsoever, these will be your partners in building spiritual values, building parami. The Buddha Dhamma, the Buddha's teachings, understanding the truth of the way things are, is not to be found in moving forward, nor in moving backwards, nor in standing still. This, Sumedho, is your place of non-abiding. The Buddha Dhamma is not to be found in moving forward, nor in moving backward, nor in standing still. This, Sumedho, is your place of non-abiding. This was Ajahn Chah's final instruction to his disciple, who was setting up monasteries in the West. It wasn't a list of do this and don't do that. It wasn't an exhortation to always remember to follow the tradition. He just reminded him of this one central, crucial principle: non-abiding, non-clinging. When the heart attunes itself to the Dhamma in this radical and complete way, it can respond to any situation, to every situation. When we need to be conservative, we can be conservative. When we need to be innovative, we can be innovative. When we need to hold steady, we can hold steady. When we need to adapt, we can adapt. Through that non-clinging, there is a supreme attunement to time, place, situation, to what each moment demands. This teaching of ours, this Dhamma, is what gives us tools to relate to life as it actually is, not as we wish it to be, not as we remember it, not as we hope it will be, but as it actually is. And what is needed, as is said here, is an attunement, seeing it as it is. Halting and stopping causes us to run away from it. Straining and struggling causes us to try to bypass, try to run past it. What is neither of those is opening the heart, attuning to what's actually in front of us with a steady, compassionate, equanimous mind and heart. So I'd like to end, and then we'll have a little bit of time for a sit, with another of my favorite teachings, which also uses a flood image. It's a brief verse from the Nava Sutta, which is in the Sutta Nipata. And it reminds me of what is needed to cross the floods in my heart and to help address the floods of the world, which I care about. It goes like this. If a person going into a river, swollen in flood and swiftly flowing, is carried away by the force of the current, then how can this person help others across? If a person going into a river, swollen in flood and swiftly flowing, is carried away by the force of the current, then how can this person help others across? This is a truth that is easy to forget. To be of help, we need to have steady, solid ground ourselves. Only when we are on steady ground in our hearts can we hope to reach out to those in the rushing waters. The image of the flood is accurate. We need to get on the bank if we want to help the people that we see that are swept away by their emotions, swept away by their circumstances, whatever is causing them to be swept away. If we are to be of help, we have to find a steady place in our own heart and mind. Then we can be of help. And we find that place of stable ground through non-clinging. In that place of non-clinging, the heart is open. And we can know the joy, the peace, and the wisdom that is present even within the floods of life. So I thank you for your kind attention. Let's sit for about 5 minutes here. So may you find the place in your heart that is neither halting nor straining, and may that place see you across the floods of your life.